Mr. Speaker, today the CBC reported that this NDP government is yet again being sued because of negligence in the healthcare system. The family of a now-deceased woman alleges she was neglected by staff of the St. Norbert Personal Care Home. When she was finally taken to hospital, doctors found that she had flesh-eating disease and associated septic shock, and she died shortly thereafter. The lawsuit names the St. Norbert facility, some of its medical care and staff, the Winnipeg Regional Health Authority, and the Manitoba government. Mr. Speaker, I ask the Premier, how many families have filed lawsuits against his NDP government and Manitoba's regional health authorities in the last 5 years because they are appalled at the negligent way that this NDP government has operated the healthcare system?
I thank the member for the question. It's always unfortunate when somebody has this kind of experience, to say the least. It's a tragic situation, which, Mr. Speaker, is why we put the Protection for Persons in Care Office in place in 2001, and they've already started and undertaken an investigation into this event, and the investigation will result in recommendations that will prevent it from happening in the future. But I heard the story myself this morning. I immediately asked about it, and I'm informed that the investigation is underway.
Mr. Speaker, Manitobans living in personal care homes deserve to be cared for with respect and dignity. And yet far too often we hear these appalling stories of neglect under this government. Indeed, at the same time as this is happening, the Premier is allowing an epidemic number of residents to be over-medicated with antipsychotic drugs. According to information received by my office through the Freedom of Information Act, which I tabled, more than 30% of personal care home residents are put on new generation antipsychotic medications, which carry black box warnings against such use. Keeping residents in the subdued, foggy state often impedes their ability to function. Mr. Speaker, I ask the Premier, why does he allow so many vulnerable residents of personal care homes to be so over-medicated with antipsychotic drugs?
And again, I thank the member for the question. My information actually completely contradicts what he's saying. Our trend is going down in terms of the use of psychotic drugs in these facilities, antipsychotic drugs. At the same time as in the rest of the country, it's going up, it's going down in Manitoba, and the percentage of people prescribed these antipsychotic drugs is below the Canadian average in this province.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier may say it contradicts things, but that information is hot off the press, as it were. Mr. Speaker, despite the number of families suing this NDP government and regional health authorities for the negligent care that their loved ones received in personal care homes, and despite the alarming percentage of these residents who are over-medicated, there's a growing number of Manitobans awaiting personal care home placement. According to information received by my office through FIPA, which I tabled, there were 1,369 individuals awaiting a personal care home placement as of March 31st of this year. Mr. Speaker, I ask the Premier, when will he create enough personal care home spaces in Manitoba, and when will he make the radical improvements that care home residents aren't over-medicated with antipsychotic drugs and so woefully neglected that they suffer and tragically die, as a patient did in the St. Norbert Care Facility?
Again, I thank the member for the question. We did commit an additional $200 million to personal care home beds in Manitoba, as well as ongoing commitments for assisted living, housing in this province, and of course the caregivers tax credit has been increased by 25% in our last budget. I do want to mention to the member also that we have a very strict policy on restraint and the use of antipsychotics to manage people's behavior, and it requires the consent of families and has a very specific timeline attached to it. And this is in part responsible for the fact that Manitoba is below the Canadian average in the use of antipsychotics and going down in comparison to the rest of the country, where it starts at a higher level and is going up.